Thank you for coming at the end of a long day and before you've got another long day to go. I'm only going to talk for about, at most, half an hour, maybe less than that, because I'm much more interested in questions that you might have than what I have to say. A very long time ago, I used to look at lots and lots of data. Way back in the 1980s, I drew maps of 100,000 settlements, that kind of thing. And it was very exciting. I'm now old and not very good at using software. So what I'm going to show you is data which I think is very interesting, but is often remarkably sparse to look at issues in the world, to look at crises, to look at what's going on. But let's start with a quiz. So, who can identify the woman in the picture? Anybody know who she is?
Jeff Bezos?
Yeah, Jeff Bezos' wife. Anybody know her name?
Sanchez.
Yes, Lauren Sanchez. Where did they get married recently this year?
Venice.
Yes, they kind of booked out the whole of Venice. So Jeff is her husband, is the man standing in the middle, with the slightly weird eye line, but at least he's married to her. Who's on the other side of Lorraine? Who's that? Who's on her right?
Mark.
Yep. Mark Zuckerberg owns Facebook. Really simple little algorithm. Anybody could have written it to emulate a university Facebook. He and I think it was his flatmate did it, and is now one of the richest men in the world. The other two who are looking at their phones, one's easy, the other's slightly harder. Who's the easy one? Elon Musk. Interesting how he likes publicity, isn't it? Elon. And the other one?
NVIDIA president.
Yes, the CEO of Google. This is from a newspaper report about the inauguration of Donald Trump, where I think 5 of the 7 richest men, some of them there in the world, were standing behind the president. It'll become obvious why I have this up at the moment over crises later. I stole the title of your conference because I'm going to be showing you data and I'm interested in polycrises, many crises, the idea of crisis after crisis after crisis. So we'll get back to those people in a minute. But the key thing about them is they're only human. Look at them. Look at them trying to use their phones just as you might use their phones. Look at them looking a bit gormless, not really knowing what they're doing or where they are. They're not gods. These aren't demigods. They're just people who happen to have got very rich almost entirely because of how they started off in life. Not in her case. She wasn't born into money, unlike the others, unlike the 4 men. But those 4 men were born rich and got richer. Elon Musk, currently or very soon, has a wealth that is equal to half of all Americans. This is quite remarkable. We will one day come up with a new word for this. A society where one person can have the same wealth as half of the other citizens. It's a strange phenomena of our times. 20 or 30 years ago, none of these people were anywhere. 20 to 30 years ago, we were worried about big corporations run by nameless individuals who didn't really matter because they could hire a new CEO, a new chief finance officer, a new chief purchasing officer. The biggest companies in the world, when I looked about 20 years ago, were all related to oil. They were either taking oil out of the ground, or, in the case of Walmart, they were providing a giant car park around the store to park lots of cars for people to go shopping, which required lots of oil. Those companies are no longer the biggest companies in the world. The current ones are the tech companies. There is no reason to believe in 20 years' time that the tech companies will be the largest companies in the world. It keeps on changing. This may be, I think, the most useful graph to you of everything I'm going to show. It's certainly the simplest. There's nothing clever about this. This is just putting the word crisis into Google Ngram. I did do the same thing with the word in a couple of other languages just to check I wasn't picking something strange about English language publications. The graph starts in 1800. It ends in 2019, which is quite important because something happened at the very end of 2019 that then came to be seen as a very big crisis in 2020. Right? So you know that that graph is going to go up again. Now, the interesting thing about this to me is that that period, 1800 all the way to 1900, when the use of the word is really, really low, was a period in English language publications, most of which were in Europe, of crisis after crisis after crisis. War after war, typhoid epidemics, cholera pandemics, disease, civil unrest, revolutions in 1848, revolutions again. You didn't have any idea of what was happening. The world was in chaos. But we didn't talk about crises. Hardly used, absolutely flat. It doesn't spike until the 1930s. The word doesn't rise until the 1930s, and then remarkably drops even in the years leading up to the Second World War. It reaches a low point in the mid-1950s, and then you see this big, big rise in crisis being used. First of all, with fears about nuclear war and the Cuban Missile Crisis, but then up again and again and again. So, if you worry that we're living in an era of unprecedented crises, we're not. Or we have been since I was born, and I'm 57 years old. Right? So the Polycrisis has been going on for at least 57 years. Okay, each spike is a little bit bigger than the next. It's partly clickbait, partly media, partly what's topical. It may possibly be that we talk about crises so much because actually we have less than we had before. If you think about pandemics, which used to be very frequent, the frequency of pandemics has reduced. Flu pandemics, there was a Russian flu in 1889, the biggest flu we ever had in 1918, 1919. There was probably one in the 30s, but nobody quite knows when it was. There was a flu pandemic of H1N1 in 1957, one in 1968, that put my father in bed for a week. That's what a flu pandemic does. It kills people, but it also actually, you're literally bedridden. You can't get out of bed. If you can get out of bed, you probably haven't got flu. And then I think 1977. And then smaller, less. COVID was unusual. The previous largest pandemic before COVID was AIDS, which we often don't think of as a pandemic. So if you think about the frequency of pandemics, they've been getting less and less. And it's strange to think why this might be. I mean, vaccination, people actually being less close to animals, all kinds of reasons. But it's different to the story you might pick up, which is said we're a planet of 8 billion people, we're going to get more and more diseases. Actually, it's reducing. The numbers of people who've died in wars went down very, very low for humans about 20 years ago. It's risen a bit since, but we're at a historic low for deaths in wars. There are wars and they're terrible, and I'm going to show you a map of them later. Starvation. We have less people starving in the world than before. That doesn't mean that the crises that we worry about aren't real and aren't extremely worrying. And they include ones that we didn't know about when I was young. hardly anybody knew about global warming when I was young. To get my A-level degree mark in geography, I had to write about global cooling, because I was taught in school that the world was getting colder because an ice age was coming. Right? So things change. Lots of things get called as crisis. This is a newspaper headline from last week. It's about 800 primary schools closing in London, very likely. It's not really a crisis. I mean, if you managed it well, it really it is a bit sad that we organised London in such a way that families with small children can't afford to live there. But this is an entirely predictable thing. If you collected data properly, you wouldn't suddenly discover that you're going to have to close 800 schools in the next 4 years. And it really isn't a crisis. Having to accommodate many more children and not having enough teachers would be. I've been lazy here. You'll see there's some text from something earlier I showed, but that's the reference to the picture. The wealth of the billionaires, if you like, is a very current issue. Their wealth has risen dramatically very recently. The text here is about it dropping at the start of the year. It's then gone up again. It's quite precarious if you're a billionaire. I mean, not worth worrying about that much, but it is worth thinking about just how their wealth can shoot up and shoot down relatively quickly. That's too much text. Once we forget about the billionaires and the multimillionaires and look at people who are included in wealth surveys, the wealthy have a smaller share of the wealth of these countries I'm showing you, the US, UK, Sweden and France, than they did in 1910, 1920, 1930. So, we feel that things are very unequal, and they are very unequal, and they become more unequal. But our grandparents and our great-grandparents actually experienced greater inequality than this. I'm not saying that crises aren't bad, I'm just saying that there may be a way of putting some of these things into a perspective such that you don't think we're going to hell in a handcart. You know. You can get wealth inequalities down. It's happened before, and not just once. But we tend to think that whatever the situation we are in the moment is going to carry on forever. Which is the one thing that never happens. I promised you I'd go through these quite quickly. Data, because you've got data in the name of your conference, and I thought I should give you some data. And this is the kind of simple data I'm referring to. All three of these come from newspaper reports. It's interesting that journalists are actually now using data. The first is the mortality rate of people in the United States compared with a sample of other rich countries like the UK. Most of you, by the look of you, are aged between about 20 or 40. If you were living in the United States, this year, next year, the year after, you would be 4 times more likely to die than if you're living here. 4 times. It's incredible, isn't it? And it's not a revelation. It speaks at 4, maybe, drops to 3 times more likely by the time you get into your mid-30s. It's utterly remarkable. It's the kind of thing I think data reveals very well. We sometimes get used to this or forget it. The reasons are things like guns, but it's actually people shooting themselves with their own gun rather than shooting other people. Right? The reason you don't want lots of guns in a society is because they're really dangerous for the people who own the guns, and then for the people that they shoot with the guns. But guns are just a bad idea. Traffic accidents, because the United States doesn't have a decent public transport system, so you've got all these people driving all over the place. So dying in a traffic accident is relatively common. overdoses, addictions to drug, fentanyl, deaths of despair, and so on. Now, that looks dramatic, that graph, because it's highlighting the ages at which you're unlikely to die. But it certainly is not an advertisement for the United States being a great model to copy. And you can see why I kind of move towards more and more simple data, because I think it really matters. It's not until you get, I think, into people's late 90s that you're slightly more likely not to die if you're in the USA than if you're in those rich countries, like 1% less likely to die. Now, the only people who get to be in their late 90s on average are very rich people. So extremely rich people in the USA are slightly more likely to go from age 94 to 95. They're still probably going to die before they're 96. I go on too long. The middle graph is by John Byrne Murdoch, who's probably the preeminent data journalist in Britain, publishes in the Financial Times. There's a little dot for each percentile of the population in England and the US. The key point about it, I may have a light, I may not. Oh yeah, that little dot there for the United States is the same height as that little dot there for England. No advantage in health for the richest 1%, despite the huge spending on their health that occurs. It's quite incredible. And the last graph for anybody interested in mortality is life expectancy over time, which has been improving. Right? If you had to choose when to be born, now's much better than a generation ago or 2 generations ago. But you can see the US is at the bottom, and the pandemic had a far worse effect on the US than other countries. We're only looking at rich countries here. The 2 large countries where the pandemic had the biggest effect was a 4-year drop in life expectancy in Russia that I always think was not unconnected to why the Ukraine war began when it did, because it stopped people asking what went wrong in Russia, and India, which had a 4-year drop in life expectancy. Not from the disease itself, from not vaccinating children, from other diseases and the chaos. This does get a bit depressing. I'm used to it, but you have crises in the title of your conference, so we should look at these. Some very dedicated scientists in Sweden have spent decades recording every death in war and war-like situations, most accurately since 1989. 1989 was the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the idea was we're going to become peaceful. And what I've done here is taken every country for which they report war deaths and made it the size of the number of deaths and drawn it as a circle. I stopped in 2022. The Israel-Palestine one would be about 3 times larger in area now. Still far from the largest. Now, to me, this shows people who are treated as expendable. Most of the killing is done by weapons which are sold by rich countries to poor countries. Most of the larger wars are proxy wars between large global powers fighting over somebody else's land, and there is an obvious racism going on there. And that's a crisis. But compared to the civil wars of the 1960s and 50s, and compared to the Second World War, and compared, it was a local war, but we call it the First World War, and compared to the turmoil before then, most people in the world are relatively unlikely to die in war or be affected by one, unless you're living in those places. I stuck in one graph about COVID, not least if you're watching the news this morning, the 4 weeks of the COVID inquiry about why we shut schools was just announced. It turned out that on one day we were not going to shut schools. On the next day they talked about shutting schools, and on the third day they decided to shut the schools. I don't know if any of you are doing any work on diseases or COVID. People are very tired of it. It seems like a long time ago, but If you're interested about how people use data and do they use it well, the pandemic is a fascinating experiment in that. European countries vary dramatically over how they close schools. How much they did, how quickly they did, whether they put all the primary school children back in school quite fast or not. Closing schools is generally very bad. This country, the UK, is bad at many, many things. You're going to see some of that in a minute. I won't be much longer, I promise you. But we are very good at collecting data on COVID. So one thing we were good at. There's a few other things. We had a surveillance survey. Very few other countries had one, so we actually routinely checked people's blood to see how much there was in the population. And we're quite good at checking the deaths. But if anybody wants to talk about COVID, I can talk about it endlessly. Crises or worries. This is an income inequality chart. Earlier I showed you about wealth inequality. This is income inequality for the UK. Starting in 1910, going to 2020. The top line is the best off 1% of the 1%. And 100 years ago, they had 400 times average income. Very simply, you could employ 400 people on an average income if you have 400 times average income and you're not taxed. Or if you're employing servants who are paid much less than average, you can employ 400 servants and still have half your income left. That shoots down. It's a log scale to the 1970s. The UK was remarkably equal. The only other large country in Europe which was as equal was Sweden, and then it shot up again. Now we're wavering. We're back to this. Last question I'll shout out with you. Anybody know where this comes from, this slide? Shout out? Yeah, it's a movie. Brideshead, yeah, almost. Yeah, Brideshead Revisited. It's a movie of a book published in the 1940s. It was about 1920s, which starred a young man who went, I think, to Hertford College. So, when you're looking around the colleges today and tomorrow, Brideshead Revisited is, I think, one of the best books that describes what this place was like. Exactly 100 years ago, 1925, you would turn up here, dressed in your suit, with your servant. Right? You would turn up with your servant. And your servant would make sure that you got breakfast and stuff to wash and looked after your clothes. Okay? If any of you are staying in college rooms, the servant needed to be somewhere as well. So they were called scouts. The lady, well, she's an actress, but she's based on Lady Marchmont, who did have an income which was 400 times the average and allowed her to run a house like the one behind. The income came from her investments overseas, which was the empire and plantations. She's not looking happy because the investments were going down. Right? Things do change quickly. Going to do a couple of more recent crises and then I'll come to the end and please have some questions. This is emissions. Normal graph of carbon emissions going up. What I want to show you is how interesting it is if you take that graph, exactly the same data as you're seeing there, but just change the axes. So now we've put time inside the graph rather than on an axis, and we put the change in carbon emissions on horizontal scale. And it's more obvious when emissions fall. And they tend to fall in economic recessions. They tend to rise after we have summits about making them fall, but that, I think, is coincidence. There were just 4 things that are accelerating in the world at the moment, of major things. Carbon emissions is one of them. It fell during the pandemic. It has risen again since. Flights is another. The number of international students is another factor that's accelerating. But it's not going to. But most things are not accelerating. And temperature is not just rising, that rises slightly higher each decade than the decade before. Coming towards the end, population. Now this is really fascinating. I'm just reading a book called Beyond the Peak at the moment that says that the major problem in the future of the world is that we're about to pass peak population. You know that most of the world is below 2 children per couple? But we're still going from 8 billion to 10 billion by around about the year 2080. Everywhere where the number of children that people have has dropped to less than 2 has stayed below 2. There's absolutely no sign that population numbers rise again. Nowhere on the earth has managed to do it. So if you think about the maths of it, if it stays below 2, and in some European countries 1.3, and in China I think 1.61, even if it was to stay at 1.9, it's going down and down and down in future. But school children are still shown slides like this about how bad it is as it's going up. The same thing on that same kind of chart. Exactly the same data, but showing it stabilising. Now that data is now 8 years out of date. And the latest UN figures have it dropping more than 500 million less than that. Every time the United Nations recalibrates its projections in the last decade, it's gone down, what they think is going to happen. Same data again, just a log scale. I like simple things. Okay? The simple things here are 1492 and 3 little ships taking diseases across the Atlantic. I do wonder if one of them was actually a coronavirus, not the ones... Anyway. World population didn't fall, it just decelerated dramatically when tens of millions of people in the Americas died. Then colonisation, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, scramble for Africa, European powers. And then choice. It's largely choice. This is not imposed. This is people deciding not to have children, or just have 1 child, or maybe to have 2, and hardly ever to have 3. Or waiting till later and finding they can't, or they have 1 less. It's the most interesting trend in the world at the moment. I haven't got enough time to explain why I've put up pictures of Trump and Greta and so on, but I'll leave that to you. Rachel Reeves, the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, was speaking at the Labour Party conference today, talking about how sensible she's being, how she hasn't got any room for manoeuvre. This graph shows public spending as a percent of GDP in European countries. The red line is the UK. We spend less, we tax less than all these other European countries. What I find remarkable is that a Labour Chancellor can stand up at a Labour conference and tell her Labour Party members that they can't possibly tax and spend more, and that this isn't public knowledge. Right? These differences are enormous between European countries. If you're interested in the bumps, 2008 is bailing out the banks. Every country had to do it. And 2020 is surviving a pandemic. Okay. I'm going to end with children. I've probably sickened you with the amount of data. And about the situation of the UK. Because the situation of the UK is not good. We are a peripheral European country that in many ways has living standards that compare with Eastern Europe. This wasn't the case 20 years ago, but this is the case at the moment, and it's where we're heading. If you wonder partly why we see lots of flags being put up in certain towns, and if in Oxford, if you go to Barton, and you just drive from the Green Road roundabout through the main road through Barton, you can see flags on every lamppost. You won't see them in the rich parts of the city. It's falling living standards and people inspiring racism. Last book, 7 Children, and forget the wiggly graph, just the bar chart. The most recent United Nations data on changes in child poverty in the world. For every country, the United Nations measures child poverty, and UK had the biggest rise. Right. Really simple data. I'm not advocating you should use simple data. If you're able to use complicated data, use complicated data. But really simple data often tells what are probably quite important messages. I'm cherry picking a little bit. But, this is the UNICEF, United Nations child poverty figures, a 20% increase in the UK on an already very high rate for Europe. The next 4 countries, Iceland, France, Switzerland, Norway, have had a big increase, but they had some of the lowest rates. So a 10% increase on a low rate is relatively small. Positive, to try to cheer you up, look at how many countries are having massive falls in child poverty. This is a 7-year period. Right? Forget the UK for the moment. Look at all those countries that are shaded purple and blue. It's staggering. Staggering achievement in the 7 years to 2021. Right? But we tend to concentrate on bad things rather than good things. These are the crises that the majority of people in the world worry about most in order when you survey them in the last 5 to 10 years. It varies between countries. There's a survey done by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. In China, number 4 is the highest, which is healthcare. Healthcare costs. Partly number 1, 2 or 3 are less of a worry. Climate is only concern number 5. And this is the world's middle class who fill in surveys. And it's dropping. It's not because the climate crisis isn't getting better. There's apathy about it. Conspiracy theories. I think these are interesting. Adults who believe a single secretive group rules the world. This is a standard conspiracy theory test. I always think it's a bit mean because people in charge generally kind of don't publicly say what they're doing. They might meet on yachts. The pictures, obviously the very, very rich men are not that secretive, right? So, if they don't really rule the world, but they don't do it in secret, at least. But countries make deals about wars and other things behind closed doors. So it's not entirely, ticking that doesn't mean that you are a conspiracy theorist. YouGov produced the poll that comes from in 2021. And my favourite thing about the YouGov poll of conspiracy theories is that one of their conspiracy theories turned out to be true after they'd sent the poll out into the field and before they got the answers back, which was Russian interference in the American election. So you never quite know. But people have their own ideas and they're able to be stirred up. Lastly, I think it's amazing that people don't think, where did they get the money from that makes them so rich? That we worry about taxes rather than whose money is it that the very rich have. It didn't come out of thin air. And that's my final slide. I'm an old-fashioned leftist, but this comes from a movement which still exists of Sunday schools for children, which was non-religious, where you go along and rather than do what I did as a child, I used to have to go to a church. I was born here. I used to have to go to a church when I was 6 years old, 2 miles that way, and colour Jesus in blue. I never knew, nobody told me why he had to be coloured in blue, but I did that as a 6-year-old. This is an alternative thing. If you don't want your children colouring in Jesus blue, they can be told this. My point of putting this up is to say we have largely, as a species, come up over centuries with the idea of being nicer to each other. and then constantly feeling that we're not getting anywhere with this and feeling disheartened. But at the same time as we've been coming up with why not be nice, and if you read through it, by the way, none of it's that radical, really, is it? It was 100 years ago, so it was seen as radical then. How could you possibly not be making children colouring Jesus blue? But anyways, 100 years ago. What we don't notice, I think, is the progress that is made. Is the falls in child poverty that does occur in most countries of the world most of the time. Is the wars that are avoided. Is the fact that the majority of investment in energy at the moment is going into green energy worldwide. Not enough decarbonisation of coal and of oil and of gas, but we tend not to notice the good things. Hopefully that is a somewhat useful summary of what I think about polycrises with some data in it. Please ask me a few questions. I won't hold you up too late to have your dinner, and it's been a long day, but thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you so much for your wonderful talk and insightful talk. As a person who also explored the term crisis, because my field of research theme is housing crisis. So I also reflect back on what is the meaning of the crisis nowadays and how we also sometimes forget or sometimes exaggerate the term or the meaning behind the term crisis as well. So now it's time to open to the floor. So please, if you have any kind of question, please raise your hands. And before you ask the questions, please kindly introduce yourself with your name and your affiliation.
Hi, my name is Nambai, and I think you can hear me, right? Or
Yes, but they might be live streaming.
my name is Nambai, and assistant professor from TU Delft. Thanks for the really nice talk, and I saw in the very beginning of your lecture you quoted some figures used by journalists on newsletters. So I'm also asking a question about that. What is your idea on the role of media or mass media, or let's say social media, on providing this kind of information with their own interpretation? So there are different types of framing of these kind of same data, but you, as you also did, you transform it into a different way, then the story is a different one. And how would you say that? Would you see that also as a crisis or an opportunity to break the polarization?
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. People often complain about mainstream media, or Fox News and a few media companies. My view is optimistic about what's happening. You know, I think we have more journalists now than we've ever had. They're very badly paid. Some of them used to be well paid in the past. Now they're generally badly paid, but they're very keen, and there are many, many journalists. And so stories tend to get out. But what you actually read depends on you and what platform you're using, and whether it directs things to you that it thinks you want to read or you want to read. The majority of news in social media originates from journalists originally finding something out and saying it. So without the journalism, it wouldn't be known. I don't think it's got worse. There is an international league table which compares different countries and how good their press is. Finland typically is at the top of it, and in Europe, the UK or Italy is at the bottom of it. But there's just so many people involved now in various forms of journalism compared to the past, that I'm not convinced that we live in a worse informed world than we did before. It's a bit like the pandemic question, where people are being told there's more and more illnesses, but in fact you measure it and you see it's less. Or the saddest example, but you know, journalists from this country are not allowed into Gaza, and yet what's going on in Gaza has been the most reported atrocity ever. Yeah, endless. It is being reported. If it wasn't being reported, I think it would almost certainly be worse. And that didn't happen at the start of the Vietnam War or to later, and it certainly, of course, didn't happen in Germany in the 1930s. So we have more information than before, and it's hard to control. But the news I read is very obviously targeted to me, you know, because the algorithm wants me to keep using it. So it feeds me things that politically make me happy, and I keep on using, you know, Blue Sky now, but I go back to Twitter just to check, and X is clever, because ultimately they want to keep you more than they want to change your mind. It's a little bit like AI, which is trained by students. The important thing about AI is not that it's correct, but that you think it's correct. And as long as you think it's correct, you're going to use it, as long as it sounds plausible. From the point of view of you, for your university student, and you need to have an essay and it's got to be done by the morning, you'd much rather have an essay that sounded plausible and that somebody like me would go, oh, that looks good, than something that was actually interesting, different, and correct, but because it was saying something controversial, might be wrong. So there's those concerns, but no, I'm not pessimistic. And take these two. She's I think a chief economics journalist at Bloomberg, right, hardly radical, and he's at the Financial Times, which used to be a right-wing publication in Britain, but is now to the left of the Guardian, because the main market for the Financial Times is Europe. It sells more copies in Europe, I think, than it does in the UK. And people wouldn't buy it or read it in the mainland of Europe if it produced a British right-wing story. So, and I could never have imagined that the Financial Times would move like this. Or that Bloomberg, which, you know, is hardly a progressive channel, would go that way.
Okay, is there any other questions? Maybe you already gave the whole answers to the audience despite they don't have any other questions.
They want their dinner.
Yeah. Or yeah.
My name is Mohammed Sharif from University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany. I have just a fundamental question. What does the term crisis mean? This is a kind of qualitative term, and how do you quantify it? So, based on my understanding, you just compared the recent data with the past century data. So it's a kind of relative term. Or how do you know that data is the base data is the optimal data? So you are now comparing it in terms of any kind of criteria.
Yeah, it's a qualitative term, so it is very hard to narrow it down. There are people who are paid to be crisis managers, and the top ones meet at Davos every year, and they tell us what the biggest crisis is going to be next year. So I looked at them. They're always saying it's going to be hacking, but the hacking is never that terrible. What I did is look at what people said worried them the most. But of course you can only do that over 30 or 40 years because we didn't ask people in the past. What you can do is look at how much harm is caused by something. And the ultimate way of that is how many premature deaths are caused by something. And so in the Next Crisis book, I have a section on the number of deaths caused by natural disasters, which are affected by severe weather events. And in the 2020s, only 1 person in a million per year died in the world due to a severe weather event. In the 1950s, it was 77 people per million per year. So the deaths from severe weather events have gone down and down and down. The number of severe weather events has gone up. The size of floods have got bigger. But we're much better at telling people to evacuate an area that's about to flood than we used to. So, and we can also look at the number of people affected, not just dead. So my preferred way to compare crises is quantitatively like that. And if you do that, then childhood poverty and diarrhoea becomes top over deaths and years of life lost in the world. And your climate crisis currently is very, very, very low. And the majority of the deaths that have been recorded are in North America and Europe, and they're from heat waves, and they're very elderly, very frail people. Which is a different story to the one that's normally said. But sorry for my rambling answer. It's a whole mixture from we can count this, and it's a way to say, yes, something really matters, but it matters 100 times less or 1,000 times less than something else that affects people. But if people are worried about something, or they're worried about the future effects of it, that matters. What's fascinating about climate change is it is of most concern to people who are affluent. Certainly students across Europe, university students are very, very worried about it. Worldwide, university students in Europe are affluent. And one of the reasons I think that climate crisis is such a concern to people who are well off is that the big concerns, poverty, cost of living, not having any job at all, access to healthcare, are not actual things experienced by the families of better off people. Whereas the idea that the future will be uninhabitable affects everybody. There's one in the middle.
Thank you so much. I'm Jeremy Luo from the Harvard Institute of Technology in Shenzhen. I'm an assistant professor, and I'm interested in the birth rate you were talking about. Do you think there is a possibility that this kind of trend will change? And what if there is? What is the potential reasons you think this trend will change? Like people would like to have more children. And have you ever heard the children-friendly city or parenting-friendly city projects, or the urban planners? They are trying to make the cities more friendly for parenting our children. How do you think would that possible to contribute to increase the will?
Yeah, this. Thank you very much for that question. This fascinates me. And how many of you are PhD students at the moment? Okay, if this makes you feel any better, I've been trying to write a book since January with the title When Population Falls. And for the first time in decades, it's been being like a PhD student again, where I just can't write it. And it's partly getting old and laziness and not being clever. But it's partly that I'm actually not at all sure what I think, or don't feel brave enough about what I think. There's been various attempts around the world to get people to have more children. In some European countries, Finland's a great example, incredible childcare, hasn't had an effect. Finland is still 1.3. China recently did a national rollout of a payment, I think, if you're poor, and there were schemes in various towns. As yet, I haven't seen any data showing that's made much effect. Russia does this, Turkey wants to do it. It's being talked about in the United States to give people, I think, $5,000 if they have a child. There's been too many attempts to do this, and they haven't worked to think it will work, it will change people's behaviour. They're largely thought up by men, these schemes. And maybe the most enlightened schemes that I've seen have been about how to get men to do more of the actual childcare. And then it being more likely that people may have a child or a second child if a man does more of the childcare. I've seen a draft of a paper, or it's a working paper, published that suggests that there has been a rise in children amongst women who have a full-time job that involves commuting and a partner, male, in most cases, who's a stay-at-home tech IT man. So he can change the nappy. Now, and it would make sense, and of course, and with friendly cities where children can play and you orientate everything around the child, it should make sense. The problem is that we're not seeing it happening anywhere. It does really look as if you give people a choice and you make their life safe enough so that they don't think I might have to rely on my children when I'm old, then the average is probably a little bit under 2 that people will want to have, bar a few tiny groups. So Jewish people in parts of London which may have large numbers of children. But those tiny groups never manage to keep that high rate of childbirth for many generations. It always stops. The grandchildren and the great-grandchildren say, no, I'm not going to do that. And it's easy to prove that because, of course, if it hadn't stopped, there'd be an enormous group somewhere which had had lots of children. Okay? So, realistically, at the moment, I think that we're likely, for the large majority of the world, to be between 1.3 and 1.8, 1.9. And you'd like to think that the countries that did a better job of making it easier to have children would be at the higher end, but they're not. Because one problem is, the countries that make it easier to have children tend to be more progressive countries, in which people are better educated and they want to do other things. US data on childbirth came out last week, I think showing that something like only 7% of women with a higher degree in the US under 40 have a child. The best contraception, I say this to the first year students here, the best contraception ever invented was going to university. Just in terms of, if you were to treat it, if you didn't know about the mechanics of contraception, going to university results in fewer children than any other method, particularly when you're at university. And people delay or not, or then have one later. I don't have an answer. I'm like the PhD student who can't get their PhD done. It is absolutely fascinating. And it really, really matters. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I don't think it's a problem if we go, we're going to be 10 million in 2080. And then we're going to go to probably down to 9 and to 8. I mean, we've got enough hundreds of years to work this one out. But this is the thing I'll leave you with. You cannot carry on the contemporary economic system of the world and have markets getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It doesn't work. You can't make a profit just by selling more pairs of trousers if there are few people to buy trousers. You can't persuade people to wear 2 pairs of trousers at the same time. And what's more, if increasingly these young people are being educated, the idea that you can sell them things that they don't need, that becomes harder as well. Now that is good news. That's partly why I end up with that list of things. And I think if it happens, it won't be just because people have got together in halls and says, can't we be nicer to each other? It will not be possible to carry on what we're currently doing with fewer and fewer young people in the world. Peak baby was 1990. There was a little peak 20 years later. But that's a long, long time ago. Peak baby in the world, 1990. Just to end on my first slide, of course, that it's fascinating to watch who really does want lots more children. And if we go right back to the beginning, the famous one is the man looking at his phone on the far edge. Elon is obsessed by the idea that there should be more children. He's had lots of children himself. with many different people. And he wants more children so that we can populate another planet. Right? And that, and it's great news that he thinks that. Because it would be far worse if the billionaires were really clever people, right, who said things that are actually sensible. Right? Then they might carry on being in charge of us forever. The fact that he thinks that we can populate Mars and persuade people to have, and only certain people, the ones he likes, persuade people to have the children to do that, shows it can't carry on forever because they are not that clever. Thank you very much for tolerating me. I think we've done an hour, so do you want more? Okay. Last one.
Thank you very much for your insightful lecture. And my name is Jackie Sultana. I'm a PhD candidate at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. So I have a different question.
Yeah.
And that is, we now have extensive use of AI in every sectors, and how do you see that? How that would influence social inequality, particularly in the job market in the future?
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
I'll try to do a quick one on. My editors keep on trying to make me write about AI, and so I had to read some stuff on it. My favourite book on AI is by Steve Wolfram, who does Wolfram Mathematics. He knows it's a really short book. It's less than 100 pages long, and on the last page, he says the crucial thing, which he says it won't scale up because it's an inefficient algorithm, which is, if it's true, is interesting news. I never expected it to become so big so fast. I welcomed it when it first came because I hate Oxford tutorial essays, which if any of you in Oxford have been an undergraduate at Oxford, we make, well, remarkably, young 17-year-olds apply to come to this university to then have to write an essay every week, which they don't have to do anywhere else, right? And being examined, which they're not even examined in Cambridge. And they have to write an essay and then another essay. And AI can write very quickly the kind of banal essay that will get you a pass. And they're supposed to write an essay that's not politically one way or the other and balances things and so on. So when AI first started writing essays, I thought this is great. And I think it's brilliant for translation because huge numbers of you, I only speak one language, and I speak it not very clearly, as you've just heard. Right? I think it's really unfair that people have to try to learn another language to be able to move around the world. That's over with AI now. So it's good. I suspect we're going to go back to more talking and more vivas and more in-place things. The Guardian Weekly, I'll end on this. The Guardian Weekly has a story in its latest edition. This is the weekly summary of the Guardian newspaper, and I read it at the weekend. And the story claims, and there's only one thing made me suspicious about the story, and it was the number 40,000. The story claimed that there were 40,000 people working in Nairobi, in Kenya, writing essays for undergraduates and writing theses for PhD students. And they were doing a master's dissertation in like 6 hours, and then another one. And they were extremely good. And if you're very good at this, you've got the same salary as a doctor in Nairobi. Now, I can completely believe that people do this. I would love if any of you are interested in it. Just look up Guardian Weekly, Nairobi. I cannot believe it is 40,000 people in that city. It could be. We used to have 40,000 people in this city making cars, But that's not AI. That is young, brilliant African students becoming an expert on something overnight and doing it. And that's inequality because only students who can afford to pay can get those essays. This is madness, of course, because none of it's education. If you're not learning anything, if somebody is writing your essays for you, the only way you get really good education is when you take the money out of the system. It's the same as good healthcare. If you have the money in the system, you're selling something, and then that generates all the need for people to get something else to write their essay or somebody else to write their essay. And it's self-defeating. But I may sound extremely old. I aim to be the last professor who has never ever used ChatGPT. Can't even pronounce it, right? To see what it's like, so I could be a relic that they can pull out in the future and say, he's never done it. But yeah, it doesn't take very long talking to somebody to know whether they've actually done anything on the topic that they say they've done. I get sent CVs where people say that they do various things, and then they put, someone yesterday said, qualitative software, qualitative, and then listed the number of GIS systems they knew how to use. And it's not their fault, but they've obviously paid somebody or they've AI'd the CV, right? You can very, very quickly check. So the question really worth asking is, how cynical are the education institutions that are not checking? Because it's easier to let people through with an AI-generated dissertation or an AI-generated thesis, or a dissertation or a thesis written by somebody in Nairobi. And how cynical are they that their business model wouldn't work if they actually checked that? But at the end of the day, you're not going to know how to think if you haven't been practicing how to think. Thank you ever so much. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. There is one last question. Is it okay for you?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very insightful lecture and presenting different angles for us looking into the problems and crises. I think just very, very curious about actually your angle and your opinion on how you perceive from the last 10 years or decade. You had a lot of, commonly facing climate change crisis or challenges. We have especially COVID, now we have the war. But there's also other crises and problems you have presented to us today. So what was actually your opinion or your viewpoint when all this thing happened, and what, in your opinion, what is the most urgent crisis or problem that we actually must prioritize, like from now and towards the next years, based on your opinion on the last 10 years, what has happened?
Okay.
I hope so.
No. I could try and do it very quickly. Within the UK, it's child poverty, which could be addressed very quickly because Scotland has a policy that's enacted in Scotland, which means that Scotland has the lowest rate of child poverty in the UK. So no child should be penalised for being the third child in a family. We currently have a free child policy, if you like, where if you're the third or fourth child, you don't get extra government money. So 57%, the majority of children in England who have a brother and a sister, are going hungry several times a month. That's in England. Across Europe, is probably worrying about Brexit and what's happening about Europe, and worldwide, just outside Europe, it's immediate starvation and war. So it's not that different to what the United Nations prioritised, again, in the last week. But different crises at different geographical scales. And the ones nearer to you always seem worse. So in the city of Oxford, the biggest crisis this week is that they may be introducing some cameras to make it harder to drive cars through the city, right? And on my WhatsApp chat of my friends from school, this is the end of the world, right? Because it's near and immediate, okay? And the further out something is further away from you, or the further away it is in time, like the climate crisis, the less we tend to worry about it, or it's easier not to worry. Ironically, of course, the cameras that are coming in on the roads of Oxford so that the buses can go at 20 miles an hour and so that it's safer to cycle and walk are going to help everybody and the climate. But saying that is controversial in this city at the moment. So, thank you very much for your question.